Hello everybody, my name is Derek Fitzgerald and I want to thank you for letting me share my story with you tonight. I was a pretty athletic kid growing up. My sport was soccer, but I played a little baseball, some basketball, stuff like that. Ironically, I hated running. When I started college, I dove headfirst into figuring out who I was. And once I left college, I spent all my time looking to make my fortune and leave my mark. So by the time I was 30, I'd put on a few pounds, and I started slowing down. And that summer, I started feeling pretty lousy. But I figured that's just what people meant when they talked about getting older. That wasn't until the day I went into the bathroom and began hemorrhaging. Since this is a spaghetti dinner, I will leave out all the graphic details. But anyway, I had never really been sick before, so I chose to ignore the whole thing. Unfortunately, the bleeding came back 2 weeks later, and again 2 weeks after that. By October, I finally went to see my GI doctor to see what the issue might be. By that time, I was hoping that it was the world's worst hemorrhoid, and I just tried my best to bury the fear that it might be something more. After 3 months of every scan and probe known to medical science, they still had no idea what my problem was, except for the anemic blood counts and bi-weekly hemorrhaging. Luckily, my GI doctor refused to give up and insisted that I have exploratory abdominal surgery that would allow them to get a closer look. So, on December 26, 2003, the surgeons opened me up, and they were shocked to find the cause of my problem, which was a grapefruit-sized tumor that had remained hidden through every scan and test. When I woke up after surgery, my doctors and my family had gathered around my bed to tell me that my tumor was malignant and that I had a rare form of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I was stunned. I didn't cry or anything like that. I was too worried about how my diagnosis would be affecting my family. I thought that if I could hold together, it might be easier for them. I took a deep breath and said, okay, what's the next step? My wife, Leanne, and I celebrated New Year's in the hospital that year as my wounds healed, and I tried to brace myself for what would come next. The next step turned out to be chemotherapy. Cancer has a number of well-known indignities to endure that can beat you down physically and emotionally, and my experience with chemo over the following 5 months was not unique. I lost every hair on my body. I started to puff and swell from the meds. I had no energy, there was agonizing bone pain, and of course there was nausea and vomiting. I'd always been an optimistic realist. During treatment I hoped for the best, but I had to prepare for the worst. I had to prepare Leanne for the possibility of life without me. And as I grew more and more sick and as my outward appearance changed, I asked people not to take my picture anymore, because if I had died, I didn't want anybody to remember me as frail and sickly. Eventually, though, I made it through chemotherapy. And Leanne and I were excited about putting cancer behind us and getting our lives back on track. 2 months after I finished chemo, I was walking up a hill from the parking lot to my office. I had walked that hill hundreds of times without a problem, but on this attempt, I had to stop halfway. My breathing was labored, and I sounded like the saliva suction tube at the dentist's office. You know what I'm talking about there. I was initially treated for pneumonia, but after several return trips to the ER without any improvement, I was introduced to a cardiologist by the name of Dr. Clifford Ehrlich. Dr. Ehrlich ran several tests, but assured me that the likelihood of my issues being heart-related and needing his expertise were very, very slim. I'll never forget the moment when Dr. Ehrlich walked to my bedside and said, "Derek, I know you've had a rough time over the past year, but I'm afraid I have some more bad news." He said that my heart had been damaged by one of the chemotherapy drugs, adriamycin. I now had dilated cardiomyopathy, a form of heart failure in which the heart becomes weaker and begins to grow in size. It was at that point that I was educated about ejection fractions. Now, a quick primer on ejection fractions. They measure the level of efficiency that your heart pumps oxygenated blood through your body. Most normal people's ejection fraction is somewhere between 55 and 60%. My EF that night was down to 19 to 20%. And just as reference, to get on the transplant list for a heart transplant, it's 17 to 18%. So it was probably around 3 in the morning. Leanne was already at the ER with me, but my parents still didn't know what was going on. And at one point, they'd been with me to every ER visit, but after a while, the trips became so frequent that I just stopped calling them. You know, just another night in the ER, not a big deal. But calling them that night was rough. And so I thought I was going to be able to handle it, but you know, when I heard my mom's voice pick up the phone, I could barely make out, "I'm at the ER. It's not good. You need to come now." I hung up the phone and did my best to get myself together. When Dr. Ehrlich came back in my room, I took a deep breath and I said, okay, what's the next step? Around Christmas 2004, I went back into the hospital to get a defibrillator pacemaker implant. For the second year in a row, Leanne and I spent the majority of our holiday and New Year recovering from my surgery. I spent the next 5 years with cardiomyopathy. It was good to get back to a normal life and get back to work. And I was told that since I never really abused my body, my other organs would compensate quite nicely for a poorly performing heart, and my new heart meds would pick up any remaining slack. Add that defibrillator pacemaker, and knock on wood, we'd be able to manage my condition for years to come. Physically, I would describe my condition as having about a 10-pound weight sitting on my chest. Really not that big a deal, but just a little extra effort. You adjust as necessary and then go about your day. What I didn't realize at the time was that a little more weight was being added every day. Never enough weight that I actually noticed it being added, but every day my body was adjusting to more and more of that burden. So at that point, things started to go south. In August of 2010, I picked up a nagging cough and started to have episodes of feeling like I had just gone through a 12-round title fight. It was tough to raise my arms, and I'd get wobbly on my feet. At my regular appointment with Dr. Ehrlich, I went through another series of tests. My ejection fraction had dropped to 15%. It was time to get on the transplant list. Okay, doc, what's the next step? I was very fortunate to get a meeting with the head of the transplant team at Penn, Dr. Mariel Jessup. She confirmed that what Dr. Ehrlich had said, but added something, that yes, my organs had been compensating very well for my poorly performing heart, which is normal for a relatively young guy who's been otherwise healthy. But the real concern for guys like me is when those other organs are no longer able to compensate, they shut down very quickly. She said that it could happen at any time, and when it did, my body would fail so quickly that it would be the equivalent of falling off a cliff. We were closing in on December, and I had a feeling that my body's internal clock would be calling me back to the hospital pretty soon. My weak and dizzy spells started to come more often, and on Thanksgiving, I got a slight cold. That cold turned into pneumonia, and just after Christmas, I got a follow-up chest x-ray. As I was leaving the doctor's office, I got a call from the technician saying, "Do you have a cardiologist?" We don't normally call people without, consulting our doctor first, but it looks like you're having some kind of cardiac event. So by the time I saw Dr. Ehrlich, I wasn't in good shape at all. As I waited in the exam room, I went into another weak and dizzy spell and my body went limp. I was still conscious, but Leanne was holding me up as Dr. Ehrlich rushed into the room. My speech was slurred as I tried to tell him what I was feeling. He tried to get a blood pressure reading on one arm and he couldn't. Just to make sure, he switched to the other arm. His face went pale as he got no pressure from my second arm. He immediately called for an ambulance to rush me to Penn. My internal clock was right on schedule. Once admitted to Penn, more tests showed that my EF had dropped to about 10%. Friends and family came to visit me, but I could no longer tell that they were there. I couldn't breathe while lying down, so they had to prop me up in bed. But at that point, I no longer had the strength to hold my head up. I had no illusions about some kind of miracle that would reverse my course and spare me from the need for a transplant. New Year's came and went, and every now and again I would have a few moments of clarity, and they'd get me on my feet to walk a little. It took everything I had to walk 20 feet down the hospital corridor outside my room before I had to lean against the wall and rest. My EF was at 4%. Finally, on January 3rd, 2011, a hospital transplant coordinator came into my room. She had tears in her eyes as she told me and my family that they thought they may have found my new heart and that the transplant team was out flying to inspect it. If all went well, I'd be in surgery that evening. It's a strange mixture of hope, fear, and sadness when you realize that your time has come. My family cried tears of joy, while at the same time I knew that there was another family dealing with heartbreaking loss. Then it was showtime as a parade of nurses and doctors flew in and out of my room. At one point, a guy came in to have me sign some release forms and asked if I wouldn't mind donating my soon-to-be former heart to medical science. I told him that I really didn't have any plans for my old heart, and he was more than welcome to it. And honestly, there I was with the chance to live another day because of someone else's selfless gift. And who was I to deny the same for somebody else? That night I said my goodbyes to Leanne and the rest of my family and was wheeled into the operating room. They strapped me to the table, threw the lights over my eyes, and put me under. When I woke up, I was hooked to a respirator and had a tube down my throat. IVs seemed to be coming out of everywhere. Physically, it looked like I had been run over by a truck, but mentally, it was amazing. Even though I couldn't speak, Leanne could tell from my eyes that things were very different. And my heart beat. It was deafening. It was everywhere. I had forgotten that at one point in my life, I could actually feel my heartbeat and I could hear it. When people ask me what it felt like, I always say the same thing. It's like plugging new batteries into a dead remote. Everything worked again and the effect was immediate. The day after the surgery, they had me hobble around in a walker. I felt amazing, and 7 days after the transplant, I left the hospital to start my recovery at home. My muscles had begun to atrophy in the hospital, so between that and my physical injuries, I wasn't able to lift my head from a lying position without assistance. Over the next 2 months, I had lost a lot of weight, getting down to 129 pounds, which on my frame is just pretty much skin and bones and really scary. I started my physical rehab at my house, and several months after hard work, I was allowed to go out of the house to go to physical therapy. I chose a cardiac rehabilitation facility at a nearby hospital, where I met my new favorite therapists, Deb and Kurt. There were so many cool treadmills, hand cranks, weight machines, and bikes, I just couldn't wait to take the new heart out on a test drive. But I was nervous about jostling it too hard and having the heart fall out of my pants while I was on the treadmill. Deb and Kurt assured me that that wasn't going to happen, so I got moving. After several weeks at the rehab facility, I had gone from a shuffle to a walk. And every now and again, I was able to get the shortest of jogs going on the treadmill, maybe 15 seconds at a time. Every day was bringing new, tiny victories on my path to recovery. Then one day I was on the treadmill, feeling great. I asked Kurt if I was able to pick up the pace a little bit. He told me that he thought I was ready, so go for it. And after 20 seconds, I still felt great, and I asked if I could go a little faster. He kind of looked at me sideways and said, all right, just don't overdo it. So I picked up my pace again. I knew what I was feeling was amazing, I just couldn't tell what it was. I had been jogging for almost about a minute by that point, and I was afraid someone was going to tell me to slow it down. So when Kurt wasn't looking, I picked up the pace again. And that's when it happened. I was beginning to break into the smallest of runs, and then my chest and my shoulders started to lift, and my feet got light, and I got goosebumps all over my arms. And for about 20 seconds, I had gotten a glimpse of a runner's high. And with that, everything came flooding back. I had been so sick for so long that I had totally forgotten what it felt like to breathe normally and to feel healthy. It was an overwhelming feeling, and all I wanted to do was get strong enough to feel more of it. I left the rehab center, but continued my workouts at home. Every day I was on the treadmill, trying to extend my jogging periods. One day, Leanne came down into the basement to watch me, and teasing me like she normally does, she said, you're not going to become one of those guys, right? You know, one of those guys who gets a second chance on life and all of a sudden starts running marathons. And I told her there's no way I'd ever be able to do that, nor would I want to. A month later, I had registered for my first 5K. I was feeling so much stronger than I was just a few months earlier, and I was grateful for this new life I had been given. Most people don't get a second chance, and there I was on my third. I started looking for an activity where I could begin to show my appreciation for the opportunities I had been given and help others who might currently be in some of the same situations that I had been. And that's how I found Team in Training. During my second practice with the team, I spotted a familiar face, Kurt, the same guy that had been my physical therapist just a few months earlier. I said, what the heck are you doing here? And evidently, Kurt has been running with Team in Training for years. It seemed entirely fitting that the guy who was there coaching me during my first aha moment was there training with me. Him for the full marathon, me for the half. I met so many great people during the course of my training and made great new friends. It's been a very humbling experience. I am in awe of all of you. Whether you're a coach, a mentor, a participant, either you personally or the people who you represent that ran the miles before you, you have directly impacted my life. If there's a point in the race where you find yourself needing to dig deep, think about me and the thousands of others like me that you're helping. We'll be cheering you on with every step. You are all my heroes, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to stand here and say thank you. It will be my great honor to run with you tomorrow. You were there for me, and I am here because of you. My family and I thank you from the bottom of all our hearts. Have a great night and enjoy your run tomorrow.